We opened our exploration with a theological view of the one history as God's history, which should give us the opportunity to ask how we see America's racial project within the history of salvation. We viewed this history not only through an individual lens, but also through a systemic or institutional lens. And so we're at the point where we can ask ourselves the question, how does the history of the struggle for racial justice fit within the theological lens of the one history as God's history? A little later in this session, I'm going to ask us to engage in exercise where we situate ourselves within that history, and it's best done with a paper and a pen, something to write with and something to write on. So as I'm opening our session with recalling where we've been, you might just want to make sure that you have something to write with and something to write on when the time comes. We're thinking about the history that we have explored together through the lens of institutionalized and interpersonal racial justice and injustice. When viewing the U.S. history and the racial projects within it, an institutional lens asks us to see actors making choices situated in broader systems that collectivize their actions and pass along their effects beyond themselves. The many mechanisms through which racial injustice was manufactured and disseminated throughout U.S. history include legislation that named citizens as free white persons and created structures in which benefits were distributed or withheld. The institutionalized legacy of wealth building on stolen land and stolen labor rooted in systems which profited white people, and the institutions of healthcare and education were key projects of human flourishing denied or granted in our history's racial projects. Knowledge production and media dissemination of ideas were also systems situated within institutions that carried out this work of reflecting and constructing a racial project. Not least among these institutions of our concern has been the ways in which Catholic and Christian theological ideas granted symbolic capital to these projects of white priority within institutions. As Joseph Barnt reflects in his work entitled Becoming an Anti-Racist Church, he considers that every institution in U.S. history was created with the interests of white citizens in view. And he asks us to wrestle with that history in his work and for our future. Barnt's assessment that every institution of our nation was created with the interests of white citizens in view is a compelling one, but it also overlooks the creative ways that people of color in this country navigated through institutions and created their own institutions, wresting sites of power from dominant forms of white control. The self-determination of sovereign indigenous nations, Black-owned businesses and schools for children of color, and the passing along of generational wisdom were all resources for resisting what sociologists Michael Omi and Howard Wynant describe as the hegemonic racial project of white dominance. Being situated within institutions today, we might experience this history that we have explored as deflating, or we might experience this history as inspiring. But we want to know this history for at least two reasons. One is to recognize the inheritance that is conveyed through these institutions, and the second is to recognize actors situated within their racial projects making choices. These two reasons for studying our history help us to feel the weight of that inheritance and to make our own choices in relation to the racial projects of today. Being situated within institutions gives us the opportunity to be active and transformative members of those institutions, shifting resources in the direction of greater racial justice. Being situated within a network of institutions gives us the opportunity to do something together that we could not do alone. In their Undoing Racism workshops, the People's Institute for Survival and Beyond has been training anti-racism agents for over 50 years. The principles of their work are outlined on their website and include some of the features we've explored in our series. They describe history as a tool for effective organizing where understanding the lessons of history allows us to create a more humane future. The People's Institute also insists that we analyze power within that history and within our institutions, explaining that as a society, we often believe that individuals or their communities are solely responsible for their conditions. Through the analysis of institutional power, we can identify and unpack the systems external to the community that create the internal realities many people experience daily. Here too, we've begun this work, recognizing how racialized legislation created systems of wealth building and directly impacted the experience of communities today. The principles of understanding history and analyzing power through an institutional lens are just two elements of the work that the People's Institute do in the comprehensive training that they offer to communities and individuals who want to develop their leadership skills and act toward anti-racism ends. Two additional principles will guide our session here with the concept of gatekeeping and the importance of networking. As the People's Institute explains, persons who work in institutions often function as gatekeepers to ensure that the institution perpetuates itself. The gatekeeper becomes an agent of institutional transformation by operating with anti-racist values and networking with those who share those values and maintain accountability in the community. Because we have seen that racism is embedded in the systems and practices of institutions, gatekeepers are essential in their roles of identifying and analyzing manifestations of racism within their own institutions and taking steps to change those practices. It is the gatekeeper who can recognize the institutionalized racism governing their own institutions. In the histories of the Oblate Sisters of Providence and the Sisters Servants of the Immaculate Heart of Mary, we've seen Mother Mary Lang and Mother Teresa Maxis navigate the systems of their own day and leverage the power of institutions to serve the most vulnerable and those in need. Through the institutions of the congregations they have founded, generations of women religious have participated in the systems of our nation in a collective and congregational way. And we today have the opportunity to see our roles within institutions and combating institutionalized racism. If we can adopt a systemic and institutional lens, we can see the many locations in which racism or anti-racism is manufactured and mobilized. In knowledge systems of curriculum, in media, in legislation, in the messaging of our spiritual communities, and the identification of congregational aims and motivations, in city planning, access to education, clean water, healthcare, representation and wealth building, and more. An institutional study of history can identify the places in our own institutional histories where our ancestors were part of the racial projects of their day and what they have bequeathed to us from out of those projects that we inherit today. And an institutional perspective might also allow us to identify where we are situated as gatekeepers to enact change. Consider this map of systems of institutions, some of the many that structure our society in U.S. history and today. Where are you situated institutionally? And what role does your institution play in our era's racial project? Like our foundresses, we might ask ourselves the question of how we might leverage our location within institutions to do God's work in the world. So we might ask, what are the resources and relationships that you can leverage to contribute to our moment's racial project? In leveraging our resources, we might keep ourselves guided by the vision of Catholic social teaching expressed in Gaudium et Spes, that there must be made available to everyone everything necessary for leading a life truly human: food, clothing, shelter, the opportunity to found a family, for education, employment, respect, information, acting with one's conscience, the protection of privacy, and rightful freedom in matters religious too. The sedimentation of racial inequality reflected in the racial wealth gap of our nation demonstrates that pursuit of leading a life truly human is often hindered by access to wealth and experienced differentially among the human family of our nation. Considering the landscape of institutions and systems, the project of looking out from our own history and into the future rests on our asking a new set of questions. As you locate yourself, your family history, your congregational history, and your institutional history within this map, you might ask yourself, who had the power to create these systems, and how was racism built into these systems that you are part of? To be more specific with this exercise of locating ourselves within the map of institutional history, I'd invite you at this point to find that piece of paper, something to write with and to write on, so that the exercise of an institutional examination might take some concrete form, and that you might actually answer this next series of questions, not just as rhetorical questions, but as practical questions. And so I'll just ask again, which institutions on this map, or other institutions that you might place on this map, which institutions are you part of? Thinking with the specific location of your own history, we might pursue the question of how we recognize institutionalized racism. How does your location within the institutions that you named provide a vantage point for recognizing institutionalized racism? Thinking about those institutions that you are part of, whose concerns are at its center? Who holds power within the institution? Is power shared across racial lines? Who benefits from the work of the institution? As you're thinking about that institution in the broader society and the work that that institution does, who is it that remains underserved in relation to the work that that institution does? And who is it that's recognized as active agents within the institution? Each of these questions and others ask us to consider who holds power, whether power is shared, and whether institutions are continuing the history of serving white interests or whether they are dedicating themselves and their resources to the transformations towards racial justice. So this gives us a location from which to build with another series of questions. How does your location within an institution provide a vantage point for transforming institutionalized racism? How can your institution center the concerns of people of color in relation to the wider realities of structural racism? Given your role within the institution, how can you share power across racial lines? In what ways can you ensure that people of color benefit from the work of the institution? How does the work of anti-racism within the institution give a vantage point for the broader change that's necessary within our society? And finally, what are the resources within your institution that can be leveraged for that transformative action? Where can you leverage the capital of your institution toward change? This final question asks us to think even further about the different types of capital that our institutions hold. What can be leveraged for change? And so the question, the last question of the earlier section and this question ask us to go just a little bit deeper to pursue an understanding for ourselves of what are the variety of resources that are held by my institution. Resources like property, like capital, symbolic capital and spiritual capital, people power and relationships, systems of knowledge, access to media and messaging, and the extending bounds of citizenship and representation. We've seen some of these resources in our exploration of history in the ways that they helped create racial projects, and we might think a little bit more deeply about mobilizing them in our own racial projects toward racial justice. In the area of property, in what ways can property and a built environment be leveraged to host the work of anti-racism, organizing, and networking? What ways can we make available the property and the built environment to those who might not have access? As we're thinking about the various forms of capital, in what ways can monetary resources of capital be dedicated to anti-racism projects? Also, what types of symbolic capital are available to you as members of congregations of women religious? What symbolic capital do you have that others don't have access to that you can leverage in this work? Thinking about the resources of doing this work, what sort of spiritual capital is available from out of your deep wisdom traditions and your cultivation of a spiritual life? What deep grounding in spiritual practices might be wells for anti-racism work in our world? These various forms of capital ask us to think also about our relationships and the people power that might be mobilized toward anti-racism ends. What relationships can you mobilize as leaders and members of that great resource of people power? What sorts of relationships do you already have in place? What new relationships might you cultivate in order to create that broad networking of people doing that work of anti-racism from within institutions and across institutions? Some of those institutions are locations where knowledge is developed. Where are you located as purveyors of knowledge that might expand our understanding of history and develop further analyses? Where are you located as conveyors of knowledge to the next generation of anti-racists in our world? In addition to capital and sharing resources through relationship and the production of knowledge, the access to media and messaging that comes from out of those other resources that our institutions hold can also be an effective tool for expanding our anti-racism work. So what access do you have to the messaging that might announce anti-racism as a gospel value, developing knowledge and mobilizing the people power of faith institutions? As we're thinking about institutions and who they serve in this nation, we might also think about that fundamental access as citizenship gives that door in to all sorts of other systems that grant benefits and privileges. How does the fundamental access as citizens with representation in lawmaking bodies of our nation, how do you mobilize that foundational location as a place from which to do anti-racism work? How might these resources and more be leveraged for the work of anti-racism? We've thought together in this last session about the very specific details in which we are situated and how we might participate in that next chapter of our own nation's history and our own institutional history. We're situating that specific leveraging of resources in the broader history of America's racial projects, which we have seen are projects that have been dedicating resources to white persons in this country and often keeping those resources and benefits from people of color. And so as we're thinking about leveraging our institutions and the resources of our institutions, we're thinking about leveraging them in light of that broader U.S. history that we have as our frame and as our inheritance. But we've also been situating this history in a broader theological view. And we close this session returning to that broad theological view from the very first session to ask ourselves again the question, how does the work of anti-racism today fit within the broader history that we see as God's own history taking root in our moment? As Christians, we believe that the creative power of the universe courses through all of creation at every moment, enlivening and sustaining us. This reality that we have named God and who has been revealed to us in the presence of Jesus cares about history. In the words of Mother Mary Lang, our sole wish is to do the will of God. Guided by the witness of Teresa Maxis, we embody our moment in this history with prayerfulness, simplicity, forgetfulness of self, humility, and a deep love and respect for each individual soul. As we orient ourselves to the future, we are not only deeply rooted in congregational history, but we are also rooted in that one history that is God's history and salvation history. We close our session together with the simple question, what will we do in our next chapter to help bring into being the next chapter of God's singular history? So we've had a chance to think through a variety of topics and have individual conversations. And in this time together, we have an opportunity for Q&A again. And my dear friend, Marianne Hinsdale, has agreed to join me so that we can facilitate the questions as they come in and engage in a little bit more of a dialogue or conversation around these questions together. So I would welcome you to place into the Q&A that you see on your screen now any questions that you have looking back on our 2 days, but also specifically from this session, if there were questions that were raised in your viewing of this session. As you saw in the viewing of this session, the themes that I have asked us to consider together are themes that build on one another. And some questions have already come in that highlight some of those themes, and I'd be very happy to explain more fully any of those that are helpful to you. As the group reflected this morning, many groups have been, I've asked you to think with this concept of racial project. And many of the groups have raised questions about what that racial project is, whether that's a helpful framing to conceptualize what's going on in our world, and what has gone on in history. So I do want to say a little bit more about the concept of a racial project, but also that I think that you will have seen in this last session that I tried to unpack a little bit further that idea of a racial project. The question, or the framing of a racial project, is part of what one of the questions came in the Q&A, inviting me to comment on the debate over critical race theory today. Now, you may have heard in the media, you may have encountered in your own educational setting, this debate over whether critical race theory is something that we should be pursuing as educators. And the reality is that what you've been doing over the last 2 days has been a project of critical race theory. Critical race theory is simply an approach that asks us to think critically about race, not as a given, not as a biological feature, but with what theorists will now say is a dynamic project. Someone has just asked, is there a phrase other than racial project that could be used? And I think that that's something that once you have the theoretical concept, that's what theorists do, right? Theorists say, okay, let's not just think about race as this idea that's kind of out there. Let's not just think about race as this biological feature, right? Let's look critically at what we mean by race. Let's look critically at the origins of what we're thinking when we think about racial categories. Let's look critically at the history of race, including racism and white supremacy. Let's look critically at how the discourse about race has functioned and who it has served. All of that is part of critical race theory, not race as a given or race as something that has fallen from the sky, but race and racism as something that we as human beings have constructed, right? So the concept of a racial project is something that theorists Michael Omi and Howard Wynant, as kind of early participators in critical race theory, right? The work has gone through multiple editions and multiple iterations, and scholars still find it useful to think about race not as a biological given, but as a human project. Well, if you can recognize that this term racial project doesn't immediately capture people's understanding, then you want to ask yourself what we've been doing together. Do I understand the idea of a racial project? Do I understand the idea that race is something that was constructed, that racial categories are realities that were made to organize humans and to grant benefits or withhold them. If you understand the theory of racial project, what are the words that you would give to it? Right? And so what I sometimes do in my conversations with folks is I just say, well, I'm an educator. I'm grounded in this theory, and I have found it useful to think about race as a project, as something that we have created and that we participate in. Well, if that phrasing doesn't help you, what's other phrasing that you might use?
Janine, could I interrupt here and say that three questions, each asking, what do you mean by symbolic capital?
Yep, great. Okay, so I'm going to see if I can push this forward in my presenter mode. I'm going to see if I can get you to a few different places. Okay. Let me, I'm going to put you here for now. And I'm going to see, I first have to, sorry, I'm narrating what I need to do here. You can see that I have shared just a slide of this history that we've been examining. Yes? That's what you see. Okay, great. In order for me to unpack the concept of symbolic capital, I want to make sure that we have that clear sense of racial project, right? And so I've used history as a way of saying, look, in each given era, we have a racial project that's going on. And I've asked you to think about who is responsible for a given era's racial project, right? How have educators produced and disseminated ideas? How has the media produced and disseminated ideas? How have legislators used those ideas to create legislation that makes structures and systems, right? So that's kind of the broad idea of a racial project, is that there are many actors mobilizing ideas, distributing resources, creating legislation, etc. In every era of our history, religion has functioned in the era's racial project. And so something like what you see in the center here, the scriptural text was used within each era's racial project. And the scriptural text has a significant amount of symbolic capital. That Bible that you see in the middle, right, that particular Bible is Nat Turner's Bible, so it's in the Smithsonian, and so maybe it has some economic value, right? You might be able to sell it for a lot of money. But if I pulled my Bible off the shelf here, maybe it cost me $20. Maybe I got it for a resale, and the Bible itself only cost me $2, right? But what's embedded in that scriptural text has been invested with meaning and value, theological value, right? Christians think about the scriptural text as having theological value, as having value that has been passed on through a tradition that many will say has its origin in God. Well, that is a truly powerful site of symbolic capital. So that when legislators say, or said in the past, look, God ordained that we should have this land. Well, that had an enormous impact, right? It shaped people's thoughts and understanding, right? And so the scriptural text has an enormous amount of symbolic capital.
Okay, that's great.
Yeah.
We're getting a lot of questions in here, Janine, and I think that you probably covered symbolic capital very well there. A number of people were trying to come up with different ways of talking about racial project, maybe the terms racial construct or inclusive project, since race is not the only issue that puts people outside the circle. And so what do you think about that? Is that something that people can kind of do on their own? Do you think that's worthy of?
So it depends on the aims. I think that what I have seen in my work with the term racial project is that very often we fall into the idea that racial project is all about racism. And racism is one way that a racial project could unfold, but anti-racism could be another way, right? And a whole variety of ways that the racial project could unfold. The thing that I have found so helpful is the idea of project, right? That this isn't something that we just inherit and kind of say, oh, well, too bad for us. We recognize it as a project. We see actors making decisions in the past. We think about the decisions that we need to enact, and we can identify that gatekeeping role. I find it useful to name it as a racial project because I want in my work right now to be highlighting the dimension of race, right? But the question that you've posed opens this up to the intersectional reality, right? It's about human flourishing, right? It's about human well-being. You could name it in lots of different ways. But in order right now in my own work to highlight the necessity of foregrounding race as the reality that I'm aiming to address with projects of racial justice, I find it helpful to maintain racial projects, right? But folks could work with different terminology, recognizing that then if race becomes one among many features, right, then you are working with an even more complex dynamic, which is very helpful intersectionally, but it can also diffuse then, right, where people say, well, it's not really about race, it's about this other thing. And the reality is that I would like in my own work to make sure that I'm thinking about the way that race has functioned in these various projects. I want to make sure that I let people know about our timing, that we are going to make sure that we end this morning session for lunch at noon, but that we're going to take a few more minutes, I think, in the Q&A before moving into the small groups. Okay. But because I know we have a lot of questions, I also want to say one more thing that I don't want to get lost. It relates to symbolic capital and it relates to the racial project. It relates to some things that I heard in the conversation this morning. As a theologian, I can embrace my work of racial justice as unabashedly theological. I don't need to, if I can ground my work in a vision of human flourishing, in a vision of a God who created a world for the fullness of human flourishing, then I approach the racial project and I say, well, whatever needs to be done for the full flourishing of all, right, is what we need to be doing. And if that means a critical engagement with racism, that's what we need to be doing. If it means a recognition of my own privilege as a white theologian, then that's what we need to be doing. If it means recognizing the systems of white supremacy and naming those systems, then that's what I believe my own grounding in a theological tradition is calling me to. So I just want to make that connection, that this work is theological. I believe that this work has always been theological. I believe that we only, in each generation, there have been people who are willing to see the theological dimension of the racial project, and that we're invited into this as a theological project. So now you can ask whatever questions you want.
Okay, so here's a good example that someone is proposing as of what the success of a racial project could be. And this is Patricia Shargo, I hope I'm saying your name right, reminds us that Charlottesville removed a statue of Robert E. Lee, and that toppling that symbol was at the center of the deadly Unite the Right 2017 rally. The project was set in motion by a 2016 petition started by a local high school student. So it seems that some people are having problems with the term project and not necessarily the term race or racial. But would you think that that is a good example of how something becomes a racial project in the positive way that something like getting statues toppled would have been?
So that helps us to see the long trajectory of racial projects, but everything we do is embedded in a racial project. That's the only, there's not something in our world that is the that is a moment of the racial project. My being a white university professor at a predominantly white institution, my living in a predominantly white neighborhood, my everything that structures our lives is part of a racial project. Someone named this morning the reality of social sin. We live in a racial project of what I have named, and am willing to think theologically about this. We live in the racial project of a social sin of white supremacy, and so we have the choice to be part of that racial project as neutral features, right? That just lets this racial project carry on. We have the opportunity to be racist, actively or passively, or we have the opportunity, and I'm sure there's many, many more ways we could frame this, we have the opportunity to be anti-racist, to say, look, this racial project that I have inherited, that I am part of, that shapes me whether I want to be a part of it or not, is a reality, right, that I'm going to respond to. So what I see in that Charlottesville example, which is an excellent example of gatekeeping, right, that high school student, right, what was not the administrator of the city council who was going to make that decision. That high school student recognized their ability, right, to set some sort of a change in motion, right? And so the reflection that folks have had on the enormity of the problem, yes, absolutely, 100%. But the enormity of the problem is because generations of people made choices in their racial projects, right, to structure the racial project that we inherit today. And that we then have innumerable choices, right, innumerable choices to participate in our moment's racial project, right? So in addition to looking at that young person in Charlottesville, right, who set a chain in motion, I look at the places where I have access. I'm a gatekeeper of curriculum. I'm a gatekeeper within my institution, whether or not I sit down and have a meeting with the head of admissions to say, look, I'm a member of this institution and I have a concern that we're not serving students of color, right? So all of the various places that we're already located, right, could be sites for our participation in our racial project.
So there are still a number of questions coming in that basically have to do with the terminology question. And some folks are wanting you to comment again. Would it be okay simply to talk about the social construction of race, which you've been speaking of as part of the racial project? Or another person wanted to mention that critical race theory goes way beyond the sense of this racial project that you've defined, because it's a philosophy that was born in the mid-1930s and has corollaries that include such things as the deconstruction of our past. So while race is socially constructed, there also is an element that is a part of critical race theory, if I understand the question correctly, that looks back at the past in order to deconstruct what impedes basically the values that we who are Christian, in this case also Catholic and members of a church, that has impeded racial justice, to try to undo that.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So I'll do my best with the second part of that question, because I think that it is related to my response to changing racial project to social construction of race. The naming the concern as the social construction of race is one dimension of what Omi and Wynot name as their analysis of a racial project, right? And if you go all the way back to my first presentation, they have 3 steps in thinking about the racial project. They say, first, we have to recognize the social construction of racial categories, right? So those who would propose, well, let's talk about the social construction of race, that's precisely what these critical race theorists have asked us to do. Let's look at the fact that race is something that has been socially constructed. But Omi and Wynot want to move us to see the material and structural implications of that social construction, right? Because we can say, oh, race is just socially constructed, and then not do anything about the fact that that social construction has created categories, sorted people into them, and then distributed benefits on the basis of those categories, right? So the social construction of race is a first moment in the sociologist's description of a racial project, but they also want us to see the material and the political realities, right? Because if we say that race is just socially constructed, those of us who have benefited from this could say, well, then I don't see race, right? Or well, if it's socially constructed, it really doesn't matter. We don't really need to talk about it. But the reality is that the social construction of race has created those structures and systems of material well-being and political realities. So we've got I don't know when our 5-minute warning came in, but we only have a few more minutes before we move into small groups. So I wonder if there is anything, Marianne, that you notice in and I appreciate deeply your support with this because there's so many good questions, it's hard to move through them.
There are some concrete suggestions coming through, not only questions. One would be that with our knowledge with regard to the issues around voting rights, that we could be gatekeepers there in the social project. We have justice offices in our congregations, and we personally have the ability to access legislators in order to bring about change. Another question was whether you see any visible ways that I think what they mean is the NCCB, I think they mean the USCCB, the bishops are addressing the racial project.
Yeah.
One more, a big affirmation of your presenting the theological foundations of this work, because hopefully all of our congregations will recognize that we are Catholic Christians, and this is part of our our ministry and our reason for being.
So the questions that I would gather together here are precisely at the right time, because I only have 2 minutes left to make my, I don't know, I could make it a pitch, a plea, or an invitation. We are a vast network of Catholic Christians. You had 500 people, I think, on one of these calls yesterday. If I could use one visual, it would be the 230 folks who were on the Zoom call this morning. So I don't have the right visual to put in front of us, but just imagine that we are already part of a racial project, and that the spiritual capital, right, the deep grounding and a commitment of well-being for humanity, care for creation, care for human beings, right? We've got, at minimum, the two of us, at minimum we have the two of us on this call. At minimum we have the 100 that were on the call earlier. At minimum we have 500 folks who are thinking about this, right? But then expand that through a network. And really just think, well, if we can see that the racial project of our moment has people who are fearful somehow, has Catholic Christians somehow fearful of racial justice, right? That means we have work to do, and that we can be unabashedly theological, right? That this network that we're part of, that this deep and long and theological history is something that we are called into. Right? And so I know that I didn't answer your questions because I can no longer quite remember the way that you phrased them, but that we as Christians could be a vast network for transformation. And we could tie that to the Christians that were back in our history, and we can make that commitment moving forward.
Amen to that, Janine. So I think we move to our small groups now.
And Kim is going to help us with that transition. So thank you all for your engagement with this, and we're going to be cut off any second now and meet back up in the small groups. And thank you, Marianne, for helping me facilitate this.
Janine.